Well, good morning. Welcome to our first show of the new year. I hope you survived the holidays and are set to get back into the normal routine. 2019 was an interesting year in Lansing as we had a divided government, Republican legislature and Democrat governor, for the first time in 8 years. We'll talk about that and what the new year may bring with our guest this morning. And that conversation starts right now.
From TV6, this is The Ryan Report. Here's your host, Don Ryan.
Well, Senator Ed McBroom is Upper Michigan's most senior legislator, having served 6 years in the state house and now starting his second year in the state senate. McBroom represents Michigan's 38th Senate District, which includes all of Upper Michigan except Luce, Chippewa, and Mackinac counties. Senator McBroom, welcome back to the Ryan Report.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Happy New Year.
I think I heard you chuckling when I said most senior. Now, I'm not suggesting you're old, but you are the veteran, really, of that group now, aren't you?
Yeah, well, and you know, it's my opinion that continues to be an unfortunate outcome of Michigan's very strict term limit law, the strictest in the whole country.
Okay, we'll talk more about that in a minute. First of all, how was your Christmas?
It was very nice. 13 kids, 13 and under, and 300 some cows. So
Yeah.
it's busy working, busy family, and still stuff coming up for the office as well, and working on things for next year.
How are things down on the farm? The cows all contented?
Well, I think so. They've been doing pretty well. The not having super cold weather that was a benefit, not just to the animals, but to the people taking care of them.
You know, before we talk about politics, let's talk about the dairy industry
Sure.
a little bit, because it is an important industry in the UP, isn't it?
Yeah, it continues to be a foundation, just like all agriculture, but dairy is really even the foundation of most agriculture in our country. It's the ultimate set of price takers. Buys most of the commodities that it needs to make the milk, and so it's a vital part of the ag sector. It's Michigan's largest ag sector, and Michigan's the second largest diverse ag state in the country. In the Upper Peninsula, we've seen a huge drop in dairy farms like we have all over the country. We're somewhere around the 60 farm number now, and the Gilbert's situation with Dean's bankruptcy is needs a lot of critical attention right now.
I was going to ask you about that. I assume the UP dairy farmers must depend on Gilbert's.
Yeah, so around half of them, their milk goes there, and probably a little over half of those really don't have a lot of other options. And if we lose those, then that's going to be a real hard thing, not just for those direct farms, but even for those of us like myself who ship into Wisconsin, but still depend on my neighbors, depend on the dairy sector to be vibrant here, because my suppliers are all part of that whole network. And so it's kind of, the whole dairy sector is kind of almost a family at this point, because we all look to each other to continue to survive and to be neighbors, and Gilbert's is a critical component in that effort.
And the dairy industry, not just here but all over, is experiencing some difficulties because people are drinking less milk from cows.
Well, there is some of that, and of course the false marketing that's been going on, calling plant-based products dairy, is troubling to all of us, but it still remains a smaller part of the equation. The real problems, I would say, coming with the dairy sector are, one, you've got a 70-year-old federal government price making scheme that never worked well in its 70 years, and we continue to labor underneath that price scheme. It's very silly. It's hard to understand what it even means. They extrapolate dairy prices based on cheese prices in Chicago and distances to places. It's foolish. And then you have, we're just very dependent on world events within the dairy economy, and so the value of the dollar is up. Well, we see pressure from other countries. The value of the dollar goes down, we can do more exporting. But people's fluid milk consumption is, while it's declining, is not precipitous.
Still there,
but
right.
Cheese and butter are our strength. Exports are our strength, and I just continue to believe that the federal government's foolish pricing scheme is one of the biggest problems in the industry.
Well, let's talk about state politics.
Let's do
We've
that.
talked about it before, but Yeah, this was a difference. You know, I know for the 6 years you were in the House, you had a Republican governor and
Yeah.
a Republican Senate, and so this year we did have two sides. And how do you assess how the year turned out?
Well, I went into the year pretty excited. I even had a private meeting with the governor at one point and shared with her my optimism about how there are certain things that one party on its own is not able to accomplish. And with two parties, we should kind of re-strategize to what kind of things can get done when two parties are running things. And I look especially towards some foundational issues that I think Michigan should tackle. The way we fund roads and schools in particular, two issues that are very tied up with the Constitution, and so they take supermajority votes within the legislature. It means it takes strong leadership from both parties in order to get it done. And I still believe that that is where we should start on a lot of these issues, is we have a foundational problem with how we're funding roads and schools right now, and we need to tackle that before we say, well, let's just throw more money at a bad system.
So you and the governor, it sounds like, agree, maybe not on how you get there, but on the fact that we need to do something about the state's roads.
Yeah, I think we do agree on that, and I had hoped, that, my perspective on, like I'm just saying, that we would tackle the foundation of the problem. The governor decided to go a different direction and go with the more traditional, let's just raise the fuel tax approach, and we can see after a year that really was not well received by the general public or by the legislature, by either party, and so it's kind of back to the drawing board, and we'll try to take another bite at it this year.
On any of these issues, is it fair to say that Republicans have kind of made it clear we don't want to raise taxes, and Democrats have said we think some things need to be done which may require some additional revenue?
I wouldn't even divide it harshly on partisan lines. I think that you have extreme views on it from both parties. There's absolutely some on the Republican side who say all taxes are bad all the time. I'm not one of those. I do think that if you can make a solid case for raising revenue, then it needs to be considered. But my continued thing I try to point out in this situation is we are raising a significant amount of revenue right now, but it's not all going to roads. Can't we restructure that? Let's fix that first and then say, are we getting enough or not? But right now we collect so much that doesn't go towards roads, and that continues to be a fundamental problem, and also a huge part of why the public gets so frustrated with it. They're like, well, you're number 6 in the country for the amount of taxes collected at the pump. What are you doing with all that money? And then you try to point out, well, we're only 19th in the nation for the amount of money that gets to roads. And they say, well, fix that first.
Right.
So I think we really have to tackle that more esoteric type issue before we just go for the simple fix of, well, let's just raise more revenue. But both parties have extreme points of view. There's some who say, well, just raise taxes more and more, do graduated income tax, do all this other stuff. And it's like, that might be one extreme, but if you checked with the governor's plan, how it was laid out to the legislature, it was bipartisan opposition, a very large bipartisan opposition to it. It was just too much money collected and too much of it that wasn't even going to get to roads, and there wasn't support for that.
Okay, we've got to take a break. Back with more questions in just a couple of minutes. Our guest this morning is State Senator Ed McBroom. We were talking about your belief that some basic things need to change to address these issues like roads and schools. And you mentioned schools. What do we have to do there? Are we doing enough to support our schools?
Well, I think that it's multi-pronged approach in my philosophy for what we should be looking at, and that's there's the funding issue, and as long as school funding remains tied up with funding for roads at the gas pump, we're always going to have a lot of tension and a lot of difficulty in fixing either problem. Then it comes to what goes on at the schools, and I'm a big advocate for returning as much local control as possible, particularly over the curriculum decisions, because that fundamentally drives what the students and the teachers and the administration, the school board, are all fundamentally trying to get at, which is graduates who are ready to go on to post-secondary education or go into the workforce. And the state of Michigan created this problem where it's like, well, we're going to make every graduate exactly the same, cookie cutter them out, and take away the local decision making and the local ability to guide students into their strengths and their aptitudes. And so I've been working with a lot of our superintendents and our educators across the UP and downstate to try to drive that message forward. Rep. Kevala and I had some good success in 2014 for career tech education. And I think that the attitude around the country even, and here in Michigan, is shifting back that direction. But it's still difficult to get legislators, bureaucrats, people up at the top of the pyramid to relinquish that power back to the local level. But I think we're seeing more and more support for that occurring. So continue to work on that issue.
One of the things we're hearing is that people seem to be less interested in being teachers in Michigan, supposedly because of the salaries.
Yeah, so I would say, you know, Michigan's salary rate for teachers continues to remain one of the better ones in the country, but the ability to have the freedom to be the professional you're trained to be in Michigan continues to be confined. Much like I was mentioning how the state says, well, do this, teach to this test. We want to show really good results on this test so we can be better on this particular international or national scale, as if any of that actually mattered. I mean, what matters is what the students come out able to do and able to pursue and be part of our communities. All these international tests and rankings are just frivolous in my mind. And so we have a lot of confinement on the teachers' abilities and what they can do, and we've made them into folks who have to spend so much time doing extra stuff in the classroom that's far beyond what they went to college to do. They went to college to become a teacher and share learning with students, and our teachers are finding themselves with less and less time to do those things that they went into the career for, and more time doing helping students grow up and the things that the family used to teach. And it's very challenging, and it's a difficult field to get into right now. And when you have a state then that it pursues policies and has a lot of discussions that seem to run teachers down or run down the profession, it's not a very encouraging time. And so I've tried to work hard with guys like Joe Lubig over at Northern and others. What can we do at the state to turn this attitude around, to change that, to help legislative colleagues of mine who don't understand how their policies impact the actual classroom and impact teachers and their perception of the profession? How can we change that? We have so many folks in Lansing who are well-intentioned when it comes to schooling and education, and they'll introduce these bills, but then you talk to them, well, why are you doing this? And they're like, well, this is going to fix this problem. It's like, but you really don't understand how things will actually roll out in the classroom. Right. I mean, it's kind of like the whole thing. We had discussions on bake sales, and people were very concerned that we might permit the Boy Scout troop to sell cookies, and because, well, I won't know what my kids are eating at school. And it's like, do you really not remember trading lunches at school? I mean, do you really think you know what your kids are eating? I mean, did your parents know what you were eating? And so to try and flush those things out with well-intentioned colleagues and help them understand better and remember what goes on at the school and in a classroom, and stop bad policy from happening, stop mandates from the state from just rolling out because some legislator gets on a crusade, and return more of that control to the local professionals.
Got some more questions for you in just a couple of minutes. Back with more on today's show after we take this 2-minute break. Again, our guest this morning is State Senator Ed McBroom. A lot of things we could talk about. Where should we start? This is going to be an election year. It doesn't affect you, but what's coming up?
Well, you know, you got President of the United States, you got state House members, U.S. Congress, U.S. Senate, so it's going to be a busy year, and the first time for me being part of an election year but not being up for re-election. It's
feels good, huh?
It's a little bit nice. I could say I'm looking forward to that.
We don't have a lot of time, but one of the things that is creating some interest is some discussion, at least, on term limits. Is there some possibility we may see something happen?
Well, I hope so. I mean, you know, I think you can argue that we should have term limits or we should have age limits, but Michigan's got the strictest ones in the whole country, and I certainly, after over 20 years of having them, I don't think that they've shown to have solved all the problems that we had. Certainly no term limits has its own set of problems. I'm supportive of some reforms that lengthen the amount of terms we can have in Michigan, so that a person can, especially in the House, we have a very dysfunctional House because of the shortness of the term limits. And
Usually now someone becomes the Speaker of the House after 2 years.
either
in
2
the
or
House.
4 years, yeah. I mean, it's not good system. You don't expect somebody to be the best at a tough job in 3 years or something, you know. And we're saying, hey, 6 years you're out, you know, just when a guy's maybe hitting his stride. And so it hasn't been productive for Michigan. It's made our government less stable, less productive, and especially on the big ticket items where we need structural reform, whether it's road funding, school issue property taxes are a huge problem in Michigan. And the last serious reform we had in property taxes was in 1994, before term limits had truly kicked in.
You go back into session this week. You chair the Natural Resources Committee. What's on your agenda?
So, you know, there continues to be a lot of discussion about the baiting and feeding issue, so that's going to continue to be up. I've introduced legislation to allow folks who've lived in Michigan, had to move away, still have family here who are hunting, to be able to come back and hunt at a discounted rate. We call that come home to hunt, you know, so families can be reunited during hunting season. So, you know, there'll be some discussion on that. There's the commercial fishing issue over in the House that I'm expecting to come over to the Senate sometime early this year, and so we'll end up taking that up, and that's going to be a massive undertaking as well. There's also some moves from the governor's office involving climate change. She created a special study group to join a international accord after the U.S. pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, and so I think we'll be looking into some of that as well.
The one issue that's still kind of unresolved is the Enbridge Line 5.
Yeah.
The judge has ruled that it is constitutional. Where do we seem to be going with that tunnel project?
Well, it's moving forward at this point. I mean, there continues to be other litigation that the Attorney General has been pursuing to try and delay it, to stop it, but there remains significant support from the public, from the legislature, and I've toured the project, looked it over, and the timeframes to get it done at 5 years are extraordinary undertaking. Looks possible. The core studies were continued last summer. I visited that project. So it's very exciting to see that project move forward and continue to sustain the energy needs of both the Upper Peninsula and even more so the jobs and energy needs of downstate that depend on Line 5's availability.
And you had a chance to go to the White House. How did that come about?
Well, it had to do with the work that I, along with Senator Casperson, Kiva DeAnda, and others did to promote County Road 595 that ultimately the federal government stood in the way of due to rules and departmental malfeasance, in our opinion. And so the Trump administration was signing an executive order, not just on this project, but on many times around the country. I visited a farmer who had lost his farm because of old rules that had expired, but the government still decided to enforce. And the executive order came out and said, we're not going to do those things anymore. So I got invited as the last legislator left from that original fight on 595 to attend that bill signing,
Okay,
or resolution.
we have to leave it at that.
All
Thanks
right.
for coming in this morning. Appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Don.
I'll have some other thoughts for you in just a couple of minutes. Well, the holidays are behind us, but before we put another Christmas in the memory book, let me share some final thoughts on that special day. You know, as we get older, we like to think back to how things used to be. Not just about Christmas, but a lot of things in our life. And whether those memories are accurate or distorted by the passage of time, it's sometimes hard to tell. You know, as I think back to Christmases many years ago, it seems to me that even though it was an exciting and joyous time, it was a lot simpler than Christmas today. And while Christmas gifts and Santa Claus were a major part of the event back then, I don't remember people going to the extremes we seem to go to today. Maybe my memory is faulty, but it seems the gifts have gotten a lot more expensive than they used to be. Don't get me wrong, Santa Claus was always good to me, but I also recall that it wasn't unusual to get an apple, an orange, a candy bar, or a comic book in my stocking at Christmas morning. I know by the time my kids were growing up that Santa had become even more generous. We would hide the gifts at their grandma's house until Christmas Eve, and the station wagon was filled to overflowing when I went to pick them up. But nowadays, Santa must have a hard time paying for all the gifts in his pack. The latest smartphone, iPad, earbuds, they don't come cheap, and they're at the top of a lot of Christmas lists, even for kids. How about you? What are your memories of Christmas as a kid? Were you ever disappointed? Were you ever really excited when you found a gift under the tree on Christmas morning? I asked that question of some of our TV6 reporters a couple of weeks ago and learned their favorite gifts ranged from a dollhouse to a car. Asking them that question got me thinking, how would I answer it is there a gift that Santa Claus brought me as a kid that stands out in my memory as the best one ever? I can tell you there's no question in my mind what that gift was. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was 11 years old, and I came down on Christmas morning, and there it was under the tree, a record player, a Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer record player. It was in a white case with a lid that opened and closed, and on the front was a plastic cutout of Rudolph's head. When you turned it on, his nose lit up red. It came with variable speeds, so you could play any of the records available in those days. If it sounds familiar, it's because I have mentioned it once before in a different story. I love that little record player because it helped me pretend I was an announcer playing songs on the radio. It entertained me for hours and helped to start me on a career that would be important for the rest of my life. You know, based on that experience, I guess you can say that the gifts we receive at Christmas can have a profound effect on the rest of our lives. You know, that's true in more ways than one. I'll be back in a minute. Well, it's time for us to make way for the Today Show. Before we go, a reminder that if you miss our show, it is available at uppermichigansource.com. You can also find the latest news there anytime. Thanks to Senator Ed McBroom for joining us this morning to help us look ahead to another legislative session. And thank you for joining us. Let's get together again next Sunday morning.